Hey gamers, it's your boy Mr. Maddie, and I'm here to talk about the Southern Colonies. What up? We've talked about New England, now we've talked about the middle, and now we're here for the Southern Colonies. We got Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. On the right thing. There we go. Alright. As I mentioned, we do have those 5 colonies, and you can look. Guys, important to note, Florida is not going to be a state for a long time. I can't apparently motion down the bottom of the screen with my cursor. Hopefully you all know generally what shape Florida looks like. It is a pretty popular state for sure. And, yeah, that's pretty much it. So you have those 5, and Florida, again, Florida's not going to be a state or a colony. It's a Spanish colony, actually. So Florida's going to be owned by Spain for a long time, until way after the Revolution. It's going to be owned by Spain. And then the land out west, so all this land, is just kind of the frontier, right? We don't really have a great way to get out there and live there. So a couple major characteristics of the Southern colonies are: 1, it's going to start out with indentured servants. So remember, an indentured servant is someone who doesn't have the money to come to the colonies in America, but they want to come. They think there's really good opportunity for them. So what they're going to do is say, look, let's say I'm like a really wealthy person and I'm coming over. I'm going to need workers, right? I want people that can work for me, help me get my farm going. Someone will offer to work for me for a set period of time. It would start off around 7, and then over time, the demand for indentured servants would increase, so they didn't have to actually do it as long. But like for about 7 years or so, you would work, but you were almost a slave, basically. You didn't have the right to do what you wanted. You had to work. You weren't paid. Now, that said, at the end of it, usually you would agree that, if I'm the wealthy person that paid for you to come over and you're the indentured servant, I would provide you with some land or some money. But that time you were an indentured servant was awful. I mean, you had indentured servants writing home saying, come help. I'm being kept in terrible conditions. They could be beat at times. So indentured servitude was no joke. It was, you probably weren't aware of how terrible the conditions were if you agreed to become an indentured servant. In addition, because indentured servants would run into some issues, you're going to see an increase in slavery. So we're going to have large plantations, and that's where one person owns a really large amount of land, and they have a lot of indentured servants and slaves to work the land. So instead of everyone having their own tiny farm, like we see in the middle colonies and like we see in New England, you have one person own giant farms, like huge, and they'd be worked by a couple people. There's your Fusillo plug. Fusillo, if you want to sponsor my videos, let me know. I'll throw you in there. Won't even charge you that much for sure. The South had super fertile soil, and the weather was really good year-round. So that's why we're seeing all this farming, all the need for indentured servants, all the need for slaves, is we have that really good soil. All of a sudden, you can grow crops to make money. Remember, this isn't really happening in New England for sure, and not really happening too much in the middle colonies either. People are growing crops to exist and to be able to feed themselves, but they're not growing crops to make money. They're not becoming wealthy like plantation owners are with these crops. So look, if they're growing these crops like tobacco and cotton, they're not even food, right? They're crops that they're selling back to England to make lots of money. So we're going to start off with Maryland. So this colony was originally given to Lord Baltimore, which, again, why we have the city of Baltimore. But his son, the Lord Baltimore II, would take over. And this is going to be kind of a safe place for Catholics originally. So Lord Baltimore II would give large estates to English nobles to try and get them to come over to the New World and give them to right to this land. So that's how a lot of plantations would start. You had really rich nobles coming over in the first place. And Maryland is going to be declared a haven, which is like a safe place of religious tolerance for all Christians. So even though it was originally set up to be a place for Catholics, and remember, if you compare it to New England, which was settled by Puritans, right, we didn't have a lot of Catholics in the New World because Catholicism was the main religion back in Europe. And a big reason people came in the first place was to escape the Catholics. But, again, once we started seeing people be able to make money in the New World, all of a sudden Catholics were like, hey, hold the phone. We want to get in on this action. So Maryland was originally kind of a place for Catholics, but then they said, all right, anyone can live here. We're going to have religions tolerance for everyone. And we do see that as a trend. The founding of America did have its issues, but you do see the trend. Hey, we do have a lot of religious tolerance. So in Maryland, we're going to have the Catholics versus Protestants, and because so many Protestants are going to start there, you are going to see Protestants outnumbering the Catholics. So to try and protect the Catholics, because again, remember, Protestants, which in the New World are usually Puritan, usually very strict, right? We're not talking Quakers, we're talking Puritans. They don't like Catholics. They don't see it. So at this point, things are not going well. The king is going to take over Maryland and make it a royal colony, and then things are going to change, and Maryland's going to become a Protestant colony where Catholics are persecuted. Remember, the King of England is also a Protestant. He's not Puritan. He's Church of England or Anglican Church, but he's still not a fan of Catholics. So Catholics are going to eventually be persecuted in Maryland. So being a Catholic in America was often rough at the start. Let's talk about the Carolinas. So Carolinas are, probably the two most important of the southern colonies at the time. Charles II is going to give this huge piece of land in south of Virginia. So we start in Virginia, and we go south of that to 8 different nobles. And this land is going to be divvied up into 2 different colonies called North and South Carolina. And they're very similar with their geography. You can see on this map here, we do have, different towns that are developing. Charlestown at this time is probably going to be developed into the largest and most important city in the Carolinas. But of course, it's not the only one. So Carolina is going to be split in 2. And what they're going to grow in Carolina, because again, Carolina, guys, everything they're growing, again, they're growing rice, because rice is going to grow really well in the Carolinas, which rice is very labor intensive. Right, you're out in the rice paddies, you're bent over all day. No one wants to actually farm rice. So how do you get people to do it? Well, you make them with physical violence and force and terror. So you buy slaves to do it, and do terrible things to them if they refuse. And also, they're going to grow indigo, which is a blue plant. Pants. It's a blue pants. Ironically, it's not pants, but it's used on pants to make clothes blue. So if you wanted blue clothes, you had to use indigo to get there. And that was, again, not super useful in the New World, but if you were growing it, you could sell it for lots of money back in England. So that's what they were going for. So North Carolina was mostly settlers from Virginia that were looking for more opportunity, and they were moving into North Carolina, and they were going to grow tobacco, and there was some opportunity to cut and sell timber. So originally, compared to other states, there were going to be smaller and self-sufficient tobacco farms. So they didn't have as many large plantations in North Carolina, and there was less of a reliance on slavery. And again, that's just due to the terrain, right? We do have a few more forests. It's a little more mountainous. It's not quite super easy to have these giant rolling plantations. It does make a little bit more sense to have the smaller independent farms, for sure. South Carolina had a lot of natural harbors. So Charlestown was the largest harbor that we had, and we're going to have a lot of larger plantations in South Carolina, especially like large rice plantations. But these plantations, again, they need to rely on indentured servants, and they need to rely on slaves, of course. Again, no one wants to farm rice. It's not fun. Again, use terror and violence and that sort of thing to force people to do it for you. Georgia. So in 1732, Georgia would be kind of added as a new colony. Remember, we keep moving south, right? We start in Virginia, and then we move into North Carolina, then we move into South Carolina, and now we're finally down in Georgia. So James Oglethorpe didn't want debtors to go to prison because if someone's in prison, you have to. They're kind of it's a lot of effort to take care of them, right? If you're in prison, someone has to feed you. You know, you have to have prison guards watch you and make sure you can't escape. So that's not great. And originally, if you owed money, now you don't go to jail. It used to be if you owed money, they put you in jail, and you're not getting out once you're in, unless someone feels bad and pays off your debt, because you can't work when you're in jail. So once you're in jail for owing a debt, you're stuck. That's it. So he's gonna say, look, maybe this debtor problem in England, we can solve it. James Oglethorpe got the right to settle Georgia, and in addition, remember I talked about earlier, the Spanish control Florida, and at this time the English and Spanish are not friends, right? Spanish is a Catholic nation, and England is Protestant. They don't like each other at all. So they're thinking, all right, let's get some of these debtors, instead of jail, we'll send them to the New World, and we're going to kind of use them as a buffer zone between the English colonies and the Spanish colonies. And it would also keep the Spanish from expanding northward, right? Like, let's make sure Georgia gets claimed by the English. So Georgia's population is going to start out with a lot of people that used to be debtors and also other poor people from England. Oops. Well, I think I'm probably about ready to move over. So I think overall, it started off with poor people, and they didn't have these huge tracts of land. You had these large plantations in Georgia, and by 1770, nearly half of the population was going to be made up of African slaves. Remember, 1770, I mean, we haven't got there yet, of course. Guys, that's right about when the American Revolution happens. So Georgia is going to see a lot of slaves. So Georgia had kind of an innocuous start for sure. Let's go back to Virginia. So remember, we started with Virginia. Jamestown, the colony of Jamestown, is in Virginia. So in Virginia, people, again, when we first settle, you're going to live close to the coast because that's the first places you find. But freed indentured servants keep wanting their own land, so they keep moving. You know, if we go back to a decent map here, let me find one. Can't be that far back before we find a good map. Yeah, this is all right. So if we're here in Virginia, if you're an indentured servant, you keep going further and further west to claim land. Because remember, back maybe when you first come over, you don't have to go that far because there's tons of land. But the more and more people that come, the further west and west you have to go. Of course, there's going to be Native Americans there. So that's going to be definitely a tricky issue for a lot of these indentured servants who have been promised this land. They've been promised the right to make their own wealth. So Governor Berkeley of Virginia, because they're having such big problems with Native Americans and they're still not a massive colony, promises to the Native Americans, we're done moving west. We're not going to do it anymore. We're going to stop the settlers from moving west, because he wanted to prevent a war between the colonists and the Native Americans. Remember, Governor Berkeley's first concern isn't going to be the indentured servant that becomes free. His biggest concern is going to be keeping the wealthiest people happy, because at the end of the day, that's who he's catering to, the wealthy people. He wants them to like him because they have the power. He doesn't care if a poor indentured servant that just got freed has his tiny farm and can support his family. That's very low on his priority list. So, remember, we have these indentured servants, and it's someone that would agree to work without pay for 4 to 7 years in exchange for that passage to America. And you really got to remember, they were not paid while they were doing this. But when it was over, they were freed. They were let go. And this is kind of a part where we're going to see a little bit of an issue here, because all of a sudden, that land starts to dry up. This is a couple letters. Guys, I'm not going to read it. I tried to find a video that could show it. I didn't like it, but moral of the story is the conditions indentured servants in were so bad. They weren't given enough food. This one man, Richard Frethorn, he wrote home to his parents basically saying, "Come rescue me, I am going to die." He said he ate more in one day back home than he got in an entire week. He said he worked from sunup to sundown 7 days a week. If he refused, to work or was a little slow, they'd hit him and beat him and force him to work harder. Again, this was all legal. It's definitely not right, but it was all legal, so they didn't do anything to stop it. The governor, Berkeley, wasn't going to do anything about it. So, Yeah, in addition, if you owned a large plantation and you wanted indentured servants to work, you'd put out ads in the newspaper. You talk about what great conditions they would be in, and when they get over there, who's gonna? You lied. Oh well, it's too late. You're not. You can't just walk back home, right? You've been on a boat halfway across the world. So it's definitely a huge challenge for the indentured servants, and they're gonna be unhappy. So a man named Nathaniel Bacon is going to lead an armed rebellion in Virginia against the rule of Governor Barclay. So Nathaniel Bacon was originally a indentured servant. They got some free land, and he wanted more land. He's like, I deserve this land. I did my time as an indentured servant. I should have the right to this land. And a lot of other indentured servants agreed. So they were able to round up a huge group a huge group of indentured servants, and they were able to actually go and burn down the Virginia government and burn down the Capitol, and they were up in arms. So clearly, indentured servants were not just gonna not settle in Western Virginia; they were gonna keep going. They didn't care about. They were willing to fight and die over the right to this land. So it didn't matter what Barclay said; it was gonna happen. So Nathaniel Bacon. That's a really important name to remember, guys. Nathaniel Bacon, Bacon's Rebellion. Commit that to memory, because this is going to be a really big turning point. At this time, we're still seeing mostly indentured servants, with a little bit, slavery is increasing, but it's still the majority indentured servants. But the problem with indentured servants is you have to free them eventually, and eventually they're going to need that land. So what's the solution? Slavery. Indentured servants are going to cause too much problems. So originally, slaves that came over and were sold in Virginia, if they worked 15 or 20 years, they would be freed. They could start their own land. Of course, slavery is still brutal, and they didn't have a lot of say in becoming slaves, but there was a light at the end of the tunnel. But, once we started to shift away from indentured servants and switching to slaves, because you never had to free them, once you had the worker, you had them for their entire life, you're going to start to see more and more plantation owners preferring slavery instead of indentured servants. So, of course, when the demand for something increases, right, they're going to make more of them. Or in this case, they can't make more. They're going to kidnap and bring over more and more slaves. It's just supply and demand. It's basic economics, especially when a group of your Europeans are viewing their fellow human as less than and as someone that is there to be enslaved. So again, because of Bacon's Rebellion, you're gonna see that increase in slavery in Virginia, but also the entire South, and to a lesser extent, the middle colonies as well. New England never really gets fully into the slavery thing. It wasn't illegal, and of course there were instances of slavery, but it's not nearly as widespread as it's going to be in the South, especially after Bacon's Rebellion. So pretty much all slaves were Africans or descendants of Africans. You weren't paid. It didn't matter how long you worked. If you were brought to you were brought to America against your will, and once you were here, you basically had no chance of gaining the freedom. Now, this wasn't always the case. At first, oftentimes after 15 or 20 years, you would earn your freedom, and there were instances of slaves, depending on who they were working for, being able to pick up even more work in their downtime and being able to buy their own freedom. Again, that's rare. A lot of slave masters aren't letting their slaves go work and earn extra cash, because just why don't have them go do the work and you take the cash, which is basically what would happen. But some slave masters, well, again, they're all cruel, and I think you can make a fair argument they're all evil. Some were better than others, right? It's not just black and white completely. So slaves are going to work for no pay, which I've said like 1,000 times, and they're not going to really have a chance at getting freedom. So because of Bacon's Rebellion, all of a sudden these plantation owners are going to see that shift in mentality. They're going to go away from indentured servants from Europe, and they're going to go say, hey, bring us over some slaves from Africa. And this is going to lead to that increase in demand. And coming up is a really important thing to commit to memory, guys, is the first arrival of slaves began in 1619. and they would work on the tobacco plantations. But, and again, during this period, they were still freed after, 15, 20 years. They would be freed, become normal members of society. Obviously, they probably were ostracized or cast out a bit because of their race. But, if you work the field, if you're the New World in 1619, slave or landowner, everyone was working hard to survive together. It wasn't easy for anyone. There was no, rich nobles sitting in a plantation in 1619. But by 1660, we see that change because more and more Europeans, especially Englishmen, have come and settled. And all of a sudden, people can't afford to not work as hard if they have the slaves to work for them because there's more Europeans and there's going to be more slaves. So it's not as hard, it's not as desperate a fight for survival. In 1625, if I'm an indentured servant and I'm working alongside a slave, guys, if you work alongside anyone for, 5-10 years, you're going to develop a respect for each other, regardless of your differences. So this is, again, this is kind of happening in 1619, but this changes in 1660. We start to see that, this isn't quite Bacon's Rebellion yet, but there's kind of, people know the indentured servants are getting upset. The land, they feel like they've been taken advantage of, so we start to shift away towards the slavery. And, wow, my brain just broke. By 1660, we shift away from indentured servants towards slavery, and all of a sudden, life for the slaves does get worse. All of a sudden, they're never freed, right? You're working your entire life. You're separated from your family because there's more and more plantations, and there's just more slaves being kidnapped and brought over to the New World. So it definitely was a bit of a disaster as far as, again, slavery was really bad for Africans in the early 1600s, especially when we first came over, but it's only going to get worse. So the slave trade is going to start because we don't have enough labor. Indentured servants are not getting the job done, and the rich people that control the land are making so much money in America on tobacco, but you also have the Caribbean islands. So, I'm going to bring up a map. I think I spelled Caribbean wrong. Oh, well. I've committed. So, remember, Columbus is going to find a lot of these islands in here, like Cuba and Haiti and the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico. These are going to be settled by the Spanish, and they're going to have their own plantations where they're growing sugarcane, which, again, guys, is the same deal. It's this giant cash crop. You can grow this sugar here, and you can sell it. You can take it all the way back to Europe and make tons of money, make those buco bucks. So you're going to do really well. So most of these slaves are going to come from West Africa, and guys, that's simple geography, right? If you look, if you're sailing from Europe and you want to kidnap slaves, you're not going to sail all the way around Europe to the other side. You're just going to drop off at the closest place you can get slaves because you're taking them straight over here. So that's just simple geography. If you were unfortunate enough to be in Western Africa, you were more likely to be kidnapped and become a slave. So again, we didn't, and I'm just going to say one thing, guys, we never saw too much indentured servitude for the Spanish colonies. That was almost always slavery. Remember, we talked about it. Originally, they tried to enslave the Native Americans. That didn't really work out so great for the Spanish. The Native Americans just, they weren't willing or able, they couldn't get them to work well enough. And they found more success with slaves from Africa. And that's why the slave trade really began, was for a lot of the sugar plantations on these islands. So again, we kind of, this really what's happening first in Virginia is just kind of the aftermath of that happening in the Caribbean first, but then it's going to shift and it's going to come, and you're going to see it start to begin more and more, especially once we get large tobacco plantations and more Englishmen settle in the southern colonies and really start the plantation economy. So this is going to turn into what's called the triangular trade system. And this guys, remember one thing from this lesson, this is maybe the one thing you'd want to remember. So we have the triangular trade system, and the first leg, if you were a trader, you would start, I don't know why I hate the order this is in, I should have changed it. But you're going to start in the America, right? America grows the raw materials. So we grow the sugar, we grow the tobacco in America, and it gets sailed over to Europe where you sell it, and then you buy some European goods. You buy guns and that sort of thing, and you take it to Africa, and you trade it with African warlords who capture slaves and sell you the slaves, which you take back to America, and you sell the slaves for the raw materials. So if you're a trader, you trade raw material. You trade slaves for raw materials. You go to Europe and you trade the raw materials for goods, and then you take those European goods, like guns, for example, and you take it to Africa and you trade those guns for African slaves. Guys, the one thing I'm going to address right now in class is a lot of people talk about how, obviously, it's mostly white Europeans enslaving black Africans, and how it's okay though, or not okay. That's wrong. No, I don't think anyone says it's okay, but how, Africans were the ones enslaving each other. And well, this is true because Europeans came in with their guns and were trading guns for slaves. They almost incentivized or gave reason for the warlords in Africa to make war with each other so that they could capture more slaves in order to sell. So without Europe bringing these guns and without this demand, the enslavement would have never happened in Africa in the first place. So if anyone tries to tell you that Africans were the ones enslaving each other, well, it's not wrong technically. There's a reason for that, and the reason does go back to Europe. I was just on the wrong map with my cursor. Oh well. I've committed. So that's it for the Southern Colonies, guys. We're going to see. I know this is a weird week with... Yeah, that's pretty much it, guys. I will catch you all on the flippity flop. Make sure you drop a like and subscribe. I don't know if you can subscribe in Ed Puzzle. I mean, I think you guys already are in my class, so I'm going to count that as a subscription. So, yeah, thank you, subscribers. All right. And, peace out.